finish line. There's no like mountaintop
Yeah.
in this SDR game in any one company. Like the best, in my experience, the best salespeople at any organization are the ones that are coming in to learn something new continuously, and they don't just bank on what they've already learned.
OG, y'all new to the game.
What's going on, everybody? This is Morgan J. Ingram here, host of the SDR Chronicles, bringing you motivational tips, tactics, and also strategic ways of how to do your SDR journey, your sales journey, also your entrepreneurial journey, as I believe that sales development is the vocal point for your career and also the mantra for your life as well, because we use it every single day. And today I have here Quinn with Snowflake, Manager of Sales Development. And the topic we're going to dive in today is the SDR is not a one-fit-all position. So some of you are wondering, like, what the heck does that mean, Morgan? Well, Quinn and I are about to touch on it and dive into it because we were having a conversation before this about it, and I'm really excited about what we're about to dive into. So, Quinn, tell us a little bit more about yourself and why you're excited about the topic today.
Great. Yeah, thanks for having me, Morgan. I got my start in the SDR world working at a company called Exactly that does incentive compensation, fairly well known within the sales development world. They built a great org. And since then, I've worked for a handful of different organizations building out SDR teams. And it's surprising to me. A lot of people have this perception that it's a one-size-fits-all approach, and so if you were to look at Exactly, selling to sales operations and finance is quite a bit different than selling to developers, and that's just the tip of the iceberg of the differences. We'll get into more of it, but anything from the technology you're selling, who you're selling to, and also the stage of the organization that you're working at, all factor into nuances that make the role different from one organization to the next.
Absolutely. And so with that, again, we're going to touch on those different factors. But before we hop into that, Quinn, I would just, for the audience's context, when you started off as an SDR, did you think it was going to be as what you went into it as? Like you were like, okay, this is what I think the SDR role is going to be, and this is how it ended up being, or you were just completely just like, what the heck is this world? And you're continuously learning now, even today.
Yeah, I mean, if you're not learning every day and every week, and I know you're a big proponent of this, then you're doing something wrong. So, the learning curve early on for me was notable, and I think for my background, I had worked a handful of more traditional, call them blue collar sales gigs, ranging from door to door to at one point I was working for a tax resolution firm where I was making 300 to 400 phone calls a day to a stack of paper, and all these people were delinquent on their state or IRS taxes. So I was of the understanding that it was in some ways going to be a little bit more of a grind than it was, and I was surprised once I got to Exactly that with proper training, there really is no such thing as a cold call. Because you should be able to piece together some parcels of information prior to the call to warm up the conversation itself, and then beyond that, if the call is part of a broader prospecting strategy, it's little bit by bit dropping knowledge, and once you start getting into exposing yourself to tools like SalesLoft and Outreach, and you can use their engagement with your outreach to be signals for you. It was surprising to me that how if you have the know-how and the desire, you can make the calls a lot easier for yourself.
Absolutely. And that's important because a lot of people don't think about like what's the consistent, they don't think about being consistent every single day. Obviously within your role, we know that, but it's also learning inside that role, like talking to different leaders, reading different books, like you just said, making sure you're applying that process. So going back to the topic, because now you said, okay, this is what I saw coming into the role. How should we think about SDR roles today? And like, what are your thoughts on that? Because you mentioned in the beginning, it's like, hey, look, it's different across the board. So kind of touch on that and kind of walk us through your thoughts today.
Well, I mean, anybody who's taken the time to listen to SDR specific podcasts and is a student of the game has certainly seen some of the posts out there talking about AI taking over sales development, and
Mm.
our days are numbered and all of that. And Gabe Larson had some good thoughts on this recently. I think a lot of people saw that drama going back and forth, but
Yeah.
um, I personally think that for transactional organizations that are selling a very basic product and maybe a inbound heavy organization, it's prime for those AI tools. But for the enterprise organizations, and particularly the ones that are still, finding their way, they don't really have a clear go-to-market strategy. They've got a good, viable product. They have some understanding of their ideal customer profile. Beyond being, a top of funnel generation role, I think that the SDR role provides tremendous values for an organization, both from the mud on the boots and from the front lines. You're able to have a human being that actually can relay, this
Mm.
marketing message is really resonating, whereas another one may not be. Beyond that, I, we're I see this at a lot of organizations where the SDR role, if you get the right people in seat, they can also be a forcing function on the ops side. So I have this mantra that if it's not good for the sales organization, then it can't be good for the SDR organization. So all too often, Series A, Series B organizations get very excited. They're generating a lot of top of funnel pipeline, but then 6, 9 months later, it doesn't translate into closed revenue, and that's a bad situation for an SDR manager to be in. If you are a first-time SDR manager and you're listening to this, make sure you keep track of where these meetings are leading to from a revenue standpoint. But if you're generating enough volume, then it can demonstrate to the organization that maybe we do need to make some slight tweaks to the model.
Absolutely.
Maybe we need to clearly define the qualification and the steps of the sales process a little bit more. So, I mean, I think that the role currently is it's a very long-winded answer, but it's multifaceted, and I think that there's a lot of value to many different organizations.
And I want to touch on two important things that you talked about that are, I think, a lot of reps miss. So, one, how did you as an SDR A/B test? And then as today as an SDR with the team you're managing, how are you making sure that they A/B test? And that could be, are you telling them, hey, you got to do 100 emails and we're A/B testing something? Is it just like try out this way 5 times? So that's one question. And then the second question is, how are you making sure today SDRs are, especially your SDRs, tracking their metrics so when they get ready for either a leadership position or an AE position, that they can state the case of, hey, these are the results I brought to the organization?
Good question. For myself, I mean, it's really easy to tie yourself into a knot of a science experiment if you're where you run into problems is your A, B, C, D, E, F testing all in one go. I think that isolating certain variables is key. So there's a handful of different variables. It's what is the message itself? What is the medium of the message? So what is the message is, are you pitching to a certain persona? Are you featuring a specific use case? Are you selling to a certain industry? The medium of the message is, everything incorporated into your cadence, the calls, emails, LinkedIn, snail mail, coffee carts are old news, but I think that's underrated
Yeah.
as far as the personal touch of a handwritten letter goes a long way. So those are all factors for A/B testing, and I'll get back to that in a second. And then there's also the win the message, and I think that this is the one aspect that gets overlooked the most. All too often, SDRs, we all see the graphic of peak call times, and so they will make 8 calls over 3 weeks into a prospect, all from 8 to 9 in their time zone. And I think that the diversity of times that you're contacting people is extremely important, particularly like understanding your region. So for instance, a place like San Francisco, the commute to get into work, from what I've found, tends to be quite a bit more. So that early morning call blitz isn't as effective, but I've noticed that people stay later. Well, ultimately and I preach this to my team a lot, any one SDR, it's like you're running your own small business.
Absolutely, yes. You agree.
So like what may work for your partner that's calling into different companies may not work for you. And so that's where that sense of ownership that when I was an SDR, I really took to heart, and I encourage my team to as individuals, is break things, try different things, but it doesn't necessarily on my end. I mean, I'm going to provide guidance and I'm going to provide some suggestions as to like your strategy for A/B testing. But ultimately, it's up to you to devise that strategy for yourself. It's going to be a fingerprint of your personality as well. So, for instance, for some people that are maybe better at piecing together abstract details of information, the linkage to the organization, they may not be able to discern very much from a call specific A/B testing strategy, but their A/B testing within their cadence and the subject lines, or often overlook the first sentence. That may be the angle that they are getting a little bit more scientific, and the call volume is something that they do on top of that. Conversely, if you have someone who their approach is more call heavy, and say, I mean, I noticed this a little bit more on the East Coast,
Right.
then they're going to be able to discern a lot more from like when they're calling and the quantities of calls and really what's going in that first sentence of the conversation, simply because they have the volume to do so.
Yeah.
Does that answer what you're getting at?
Yeah. So more so getting granular, because it's because I said ultimately, like what you said, it's breaking down the steps, right? It's breaking down, is it the email, is it the phone, is it the social? You got to figure out what those first steps are, and then from there make those adjustments. It's essentially what you're saying, and that's what I was asking there.
Yeah. I mean, everything comes back to an algebra equation. It
Mm.
really does. If you like all of these different, the purpose of this conversation is talking about how the SDR's role is different from one organization to the next. But one consistency is that there's always a code to be cracked.
Absolutely.
And so if you can break it down to an algebra equation of activities and content and medium, and you start to you'll never perfect the formula, but some idea of the formula to guide your behavior, that's the nirvana right there.
Yeah. And with all that, because you're talking about formulas and process and making sure you understand it, this kind of goes to the next question, which is how important is understanding your persona as an SDR? And do you tell your reps to break that down into a formula, or is it more so just like, hey, just understand these personas based on the challenging parties that we have for our organization?
Well, let me take a step back. I mean, in the spirit of this conversation, I think where a lot of SDRs, particularly if they're transitioning in the SDR role from one company to the next, or oftentimes they're transitioning into an AE role that will still require them to spend 80% of their time prospecting.
Right.
They assume that because they understand how to prospect into one persona at one organization, or 2 to 3 personas at one organization, that it's this carbon copy. Beyond that, they maybe will assume that selling into Atlanta is the exact same thing as selling into New Jersey, when there's nuances, there's differences. So I think what's important is someone is getting into a new role and they're understanding the selling motions of that organization, or even better, like during the interview process, is contacting people that do that job. And I mean, one approach that I encourage my reps to do is they'll go into Sales Navigator,
Yep.
they'll have them look up their university and find someone that's in that ideal customer profile and contact them just hat in hand asking for help, and not like the SDR, like, help me out.
I'm looking for help, pitch.
No,
Yeah.
like genuinely, like, I have no vested interest. I'm a fellow CU buff.
Yep.
I saw that you were in this role, and to be honest, I'm having a little bit of trouble figuring it out, the challenges faced by someone in your role. I find that to be as valuable, if not more valuable, than any of the content that the company is generating, as like having a sounding board for this SDR to really, in a non-threatening manner and in a completely open table, ask questions that get them to piece together. And I mean, for myself, I was bowling with a college roommate this weekend, and I've been at Snowflake for 6 months, and there's some changes on the horizon,
Right.
for our technology, and I understand it, but his role is really in the crosshairs of it. And I set up some time this week just to chat with him, to better understand in his world what those pains are, because it's challenging to go into a new job. And it's the biggest mistake, in my opinion, that people will make is they'll call someone with 25 years of experience on their first 2 weeks of cold calls and act like they completely understand what they're going through. And while I do, like, I'm an advocate of the challenger sale, of teaching, tailoring, take control, I think that takes time, and you have to be reasonable with yourself to take the time to understand, what really moves the needle for these people.
You cannot expect to come into a conversation with 2 months and even this, Quinn, I just bring up one point. Even if you have been an SDR and you go into another organization, you still don't have the understanding of the persona yet to directly talk like you probably were at your previous company if you were there for a year and a half. So again, you have to do the learnings. You have to reach out to people like you just said. My thing that I did when I joined JBarrows, I had no idea what enablement did. So I reached out to people that were in enablement in my network, ask other people, can you help me out? That was a way for me to get an understanding of who I was reaching out to. Because I can sound the most confident person in the world, but if I'm not hitting home with the points that they are looking to get hit on, then it doesn't even matter and I'm out of the loop.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, I think of your world, it's like, in my experience, the people that are in the enablement role, persona wise, are quite a bit different
Yeah.
than your typical sales leaders. And some of the example I use is that exactly we would, um, if we were rubbing someone the wrong way because we've been contacting them a lot, we'd drop this line, hopefully you view perseverance as a virtue, because I'm new in my career and it's really the only way that I can be successful.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that if you're calling a VP of sales, they're like, right on. That's great. I wish my sales reps would do that.
Right.
But if you're calling someone who's buried in Salesforce reports all the time, and I'm saying all enablement people are, but you land on someone and you can't resonate with them, it could actually have the opposite effect, where it's like, I mean, if I'm in your shoes, it could rub them like, well, that's not really how we want them to sell. So yeah, I think that's a great approach that you take there.
Yeah, you have to understand that. And if you don't, then again, you're not going to be hitting the numbers you want to hit. And then also you're not going to be talking to people you want to talk to, which is why, again, you got to figure out who you're talking to from a persona standpoint, because those approaches are different. Because if, let's say, I'm used to sell to marketing, well, the way I feel how I used to sell to marketing, I cannot do that against sales, because the salespeople are going to basically just blow me off. But if I did what I'm doing to salespeople now to marketing people, they're going to run away, right? So you got to understand who you're talking to. You got to understand their language. You got to understand their day-to-day and how to communicate with them on the right channel.
Absolutely. I mean, in the past, two of the past three companies I've been at, including Snowflake, and prior to that, I was working at a company called Eggplant that was selling image-based QA testing solutions. That's particularly relevant with technical roles. Not saying that everybody in those roles is introverted, but a lot of them are.
Yeah.
And it's a completely different, selling motion, in my opinion, to get momentum in those types of organizations. And some of that hard press that you may do with, sales or finance professionals, just isn't gonna work as well with someone who is, has like a preconceived understanding of what a salesperson is.
Agreed. And then from there, right, we were talking about all these different variables. I think next it comes into what do people need to be doing to be a great SDR in multiple industries. So we just kind of touched on that, but let's kind of expand and get more depth into it. Let's say, again, hey, I'm targeting people in the ad tech space, and now I got to go talk to people who are on a more technical role. What should an SDR be doing to make sure that they fit into that and they don't try to do the same things that made them successful and then move into the next role, which probably aren't going to be the same levers, not going to be the same motions?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and a lot of people struggle with it. Um, there's no real silver bullet, but for me, I like finding third-party information. So generally in any industry, there's an annual or biannual report on that industry, and I will really, really sink my teeth into the third-party stuff, because it's one thing to get your company, you know, Kool-Aid, call it, and great use cases. And I'm fortunate at Snowflake, like we have great customer testimonials. Some of the KPIs, I'm reluctant to have SDRs to lead with that, because they're so powerful that they come across as being fake. But for me, when I went to Eggplant, for instance, there's this world quality report, which is a report on QA testing that's put out every other year, and it gave me an understanding of like some of the other technologies in the space. It gave me understanding of the trends in the industry, so that when I was speaking to someone, and I'm not saying like spend a like an hour and a half breezing through it. I'm saying like,
Yeah.
buckle up, spend a few weekends, like make it like a Maymester course where you're trying to fit in a lot of education in a month's time, and really get to understand some of those things. And I think this is a key part. You're not trying to get answers, you're trying to get curiosity. So for me, if I can read through one of those reports and there's our dense 70-page reports, and have 15, 20 things that I don't quite understand, it's going to build my brand internally, because I'm going to be asking, higher level questions to the account executives, to my management, to the leadership team. But then also it allows me to connect the dots to where our technology and our pitch fits into the world that we're trying to sell into.
Yeah, and that's where the framework comes into play. Doing the study with yourself, again, working with other leaders. Because if you don't understand those frameworks, very difficult for you to go on that process. Is there, for leaders like yourself, sounds like you are developing that process as well. Are you finding that other leaders don't have that process, where a new SDR is coming in, it's kind of like, hey, figure it out? We all know how that pans out. So what are some advice to some leaders that are maybe listening in and they haven't developed that structure, that process yet?
That's a good question. I mean, it's tough. And I think that the SDR management role, particularly in some of the early stage organizations, they get a lot thrown at them. They're doing sales ops, marketing ops, recruiting, training, enablement. And I think that part of it with a smaller team is having a pulse of your team and having a pulse of their aptitude to retain information. A former colleague of mine was actually talking about later stage presentations, and he said that people will retain 15% of any given presentation. So
Yep.
your job as a presenter is to shepherd them to the most important information. And I think that that's extremely important. That budding leaders are able to mitigate the noise for their team and put it into phases, because they're not going to learn it all at overnight. But when you have a new SDR and they're primed and they're eager and they're excited,
Right.
that's when you really have to capitalize at steering them towards the highest impact information. It also comes to managing their expectations, though. If there's no finish line, there's no like mountaintop
Yeah.
in this SDR game in any one company. Like the best, in my experience, the best salespeople at any organization are the ones that are coming in to learn something new continuously, and they don't just bank on what they've already learned. And so I think that sometimes SDRs come in and they're oftentimes fresh out of university, and they think that, okay, like it's very linear. I do X, Y, Z, I learn it, and then the next progression is AE, and I'm a master at SDR at that point. And it's like, no, it's you've made it to, I make the analogy of like Hard Knocks.
Yeah,
You,
yeah,
you made it to the show. Now the real work begins, and it never stops. And so I think that that's the best thing that two things that SDR leaders can do is limit the noise so that they're focused on the highest value stuff out the gate, and managing the expectations that like they structure it in a way where I like to do a 1 week, 2 week, 3 week, and we're fortunate at Snowflake we have a robust enablement org that takes a lot of this off my plate, but then also like a 30, 60, 90, and providing as much visibility and as much clarity. So it's not like I'm very prescriptive. Hey, week 1, week 2, week 3, these are what you have to know. Month 1, month 2, month 3, and I put them in categories. I think that helps helps SDRs come to the terms with the fact that they're not gonna slay the dragon overnight.
no,
That it's a long-term process.
it is definitely a long-term process. There's still things to learn. There's still new evolutions. I'm still finding out new ways to get in front of a prospect every single day, and we all have to be continuously doing that. And because of that, I think people only see the SDR role as, oh, well, just cranking out a ton of emails and cranking out of calls. There's a lot of innovation as we talked about today. There's a lot of persona-based messaging that goes into it, multiple industries, the really thought process of talking to an executive that has 20, 25 years of experience. It's not an easy ask. So where do you feel like AEs, even SDRs themselves and leaders, take the role for granted, and what can we be doing to help people understand that the SDR role is not just a one fit thing; it's across all multiple companies and different.
Yeah. Well, that's a little loaded one. I mean,
Yeah,
we'll, we'll have to go into overtime on that. But I, I mean, I think that one thing I notice, and it's probably my biggest pet peeve, is when AEs aren't willing to invest in SDRs. There's this misconception when, say, there's like a 4-to-1 AE to SDR ratio, and there's this misconception that if they kick back some meetings because the SDR's time is like a zero-sum game,
yeah,
that they'll get more of the SDR's attention. I've actually noticed the opposite. I've noticed that if they don't invest in them and they just like, hey, this meeting's up against the ropes, will you schedule it for me and you get credit, you get paid, that the SDR grows to expect that and they don't work as hard for them. Whereas if you're willing to spend, especially on that front end, a little bit of time sharing your knowledge with the SDR, teaching them, because if you're an AE and you have 7 years of experience and you've got an SDR who's in the first month on their job, that knowledge transfer is massive.
right.
And when I know an SDR has had a good call with their AE, like a account review, when they come back with a big old grin and they're excited because someone's invested in them learning it. It goes back to like the teach a man to fish, teach a man or woman to fish. So that would be one thing is the misconception is that they're just there to mindlessly generate meetings, and it's sort of you plug in an SDR team, and this, I'll transition a little bit to leaders. I think at smaller organizations, oftentimes sales leaders at smaller organizations delegate way too much to first-time SDR managers. They're looking to them to make decisions about sales motions, ops. And for me, like in a lot of those situations is great. I learned a lot.
Yep.
But I wasn't the best person for it. And I think that they use the SDR function to cover some of the existing gaps in the sales process. So it's like everything's great when there's a bunch of top of funnel pipeline, but if we don't have clear qualification or a clear sales process for moving it through the funnel,
Right.
then a lot of problems emerge. And just meetings for meeting's sake is a waste of everybody's time. So I think that oftentimes sales leaders that have been managing full cycle sales reps for 10, 15 years, and this is this is certainly isn't universal,
Right.
but they it's kind of like alcohol in high school. Everybody's talking about it. Everybody acts like they're doing it. I'm not advocating for public service
Where's this
announcement.
going into? Quinn's like, turn up, everybody get lit. Like, what's going on?
No, but it's something it's very hyped up, and everybody thinks that they should be doing an SDR team in an early stage startup. And what I notice is a lot of these sales leaders, they don't take the time to really learn the fundamentals. So before you're willing to pitch your board on implementing an SDR team, like, you should study it. You should read Trish Bertuzzi's Bridge Group report thoroughly. You should get back to what I call the Rosetta Stone, which is Aaron Ross's book. And you should really become a student of the SDR role. And if you do, you'll start to understand that it varies from organization to organization, and that's fine, but it's going to take a little bit of heavy lifting from the senior leadership to make sure that the selling motions that a new SDR manager is implementing are in line with the actual needs of the business. Because if you're investing, call it $500,000 to $1 million into a new SDR role, that's a good chunk of change for a role that doesn't directly correlate into closed revenue.
Right.
And so it's worth your time to really become a student of that game, which, oh, by the way, is different from the full cycle game, as you know.
Right.
And learn it. And beyond that, maybe, I really think if it's your first go at an SDR team, that they should be leaning on orgs or consultants like you and John have set up for the training side.
Absolutely.
And then other ones that are out there to provide them with some context, so you're not putting all of these important decisions on a first-time manager.
Yeah, because then that's just gonna cause so much headache in the long term, because process data is not gonna be there. I mean, that was for me when I first was an SDR manager. I was doing enablement. I was somehow doing ops, right? I was somehow managing, and I'm hiring, and like somehow I gotta HR the reps too, make sure I'm not doing anything crazy. So yeah, you get put so many responsibilities on you, and then you don't really know what to do because you don't have that guidance, or maybe leadership doesn't come in to really take the reins on that fully. And that kind of leads into like the wrap up of what we're talking about today. The last question I was asked everybody as we're diving into this is, what is the best piece of advice you have for SDRs as they enter into a new role?
Man, my team will laugh when they listen to this because I'm full of colloquial sayings, and so it's a challenge for me to narrow it down. I think that, well, give me 1 second here. Let me gather my thoughts.
For sure.
I think that getting back to what we were talking about with the leaders, I'll start with the leaders. If you're implementing a new SDR org team in your org, do not assume that it will be the exact same thing as the SDR org or SDR team in another org you're at.
Yep.
They will inevitably be different. There are nuances to every single one of them. If you're a new SDR, good things come to those who hustle. I mean, there's a lot of people that can kind of fake it till they make it just through pure grit. If I were to narrow down the skill sets that I look for in someone, is that drive for results, grit, which is somewhat cliche. Intellectual curiosity is extremely important. Like, they have to be entrepreneurial about their career. And what I mean is, like, you have to make some sacrifice. The people that are really good SDRs generally are making sacrifices to allow themselves to get better.
Yep.
And then the final one is coachability. Find that person who's in the org, the sales. If you're a new SDR, find the best SDR. And I'm sure this has been said on your podcast many times.
Absolutely.
Find the best SDR, and if they don't have an SDR, find the AE has the most robust pipeline, and just align yourself with them and carbon copy whatever you can, but then have the intellectual curiosity to be able to question why. because no one person is ever perfect at this, and every model can be improved. But you'll get a head start if you carbon copy the people that do it best and work real hard. So to summarize, intellectual curiosity, huge. Grit, you want to be the hardest working person on the sales floor. And coachability, be open to constructive feedback, and that doesn't have to be exclusively in your company. Seek out feedback from other people, and my gut is that people that are listening to this podcast, they're already part of the way there, because they're listening into podcasts, they're seeking out information.
Yep.
Most organizations are not able to set you up for success. The success comes from within. It's a fire in the belly.
It does, yeah. It's a skill versus skill will. Skill will is what everyone needs always to think about. Like, what's the skill set that you have, and then do you have the willpower to do it? And obviously, the more will you have, the more successful you'll be, because that's ultimately it's the one thing you control, is that innate. Like, can we get after it? Can we do it? So, Quinn, thanks so much for hopping on the SDR Chronicles today.
Appreciate it.
Great topic, great conversation. Before we get out of here, is there anything that you want to shout out? Anything else you want to add? Any last nugget you want to share? Anything that you want to? Anything you want to do here before we?
You don't want to open me up for that open-ended question. Hey, the shout out I will say, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it, is I am so grateful to be at Snowflake Computing right now. And I'm grateful for all the other opportunities. Exactly was a great place to work because we sold sales incentive compensation. But I will say we're building something special here. So if you're in Denver or San Francisco, and we're priding ourselves on, and I run the risk of coming across as arrogant, is, we want to build a super team. We want to have a truly elite SDR organization, and we're a very enabled organization that's investing a lot into the SDR function. So if that seems like something that resonates with you, and my words on this podcast resonate with you, please hit me up on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to discuss the opportunity further.
Awesome. Well, Quinn, thank you so much again for having us, SDR Chronicles. As I always say, guys, keep dialing, and I'll see you all soon.
Thanks, Mark.